Now that we're beginning to get more informed about how bones behave, how their behavior is described in research, how it is assessed, I think we are ready to go more deeply into how cranial bones and sutures behave. But first, I'll invite you to go back in time to when Sutherland first described what he called the crazy thought. This is an opportunity to start a new task related to this course, which involves critically appraising the historical writings and sayings in cranial osteopathy. The aim is not to criticize or emphasize, it's more a matter of clarification. The following passage is taken from the short biography of William Garner Sutherland, written by his second wife, Ada. This booklet, published in 1962, offers a personal recount of how the idea of a potential mobility of cranial bones initially came out. On page 12, Sutherland recalls,
"As I stood looking and thinking in the channel of Dr. Still's philosophy, my attention was called to the beveled articular surfaces of the sphenoid bone. Suddenly there came a thought. I call it a guiding thought, beveled like the gills of a fish, indicating articular mobility for a respiratory mechanism."
And a little later he asks,
"But why that beveling, if not for a purpose? Couldn't that purpose be provision for movement?"
This is the very essence of that crazy thought. I think this is some sort of how it all began passage, and the goal here is to put things into perspective, to see how this idea still holds up today and how things don't work exactly in the described way. And to help us appraise the rationale by which bones fit together in order to move in a certain way, we have at our disposal a very interesting study which has been led by a team at Harvard and which ended up in 2 different publications, to which I would like you to have a look just right now. Here are the 2 articles. Here's the team of researchers from Harvard, so this is a serious study, it's not a hypothetical thing. And the second article has been published in the Journal of Morphology, which is in the high standards of the discipline. In this first article, the authors begin with the following observations. In vivo strain measurements across sutures in multiple species have established that the shape of cranial sutures is in part determined by the forces experienced by the skull, particularly by the repetitive forces generated by muscle contraction during mastication. These are observations we will find back when we will study sutures in humans, and most particularly during infancy. The research objectives are very clear. First, they want to measure deformation within and between skull bones during feeding. Second, they want to provide hypotheses for the mechanisms involved. And thirdly, they want to find if there's a link between suture shape and function, so between form and function during feeding. How did they proceed? Unsurprisingly, we find back those very famous strain gauges that we have encountered for the deformation of tibia, metatarsal, and so on, and they put it across the sutures, but also within the bone, on the surface of the bone. This is the interfrontal suture, this is the interparietal suture, this is the frontoparietal suture. It's a fish species where those sutures are not at all fused. So what did they discover? First, they found that when the fish were simply breathing or resting or swimming, the strain gauges recorded 0 strain across each suture. Here you see pictures of the experiment with the gauge and the wires and the collected data, and here you see that when the fish rest or swim, when they don't activate their feeding apparatus, the strain gauges recorded 0 deformation. We will find back the same results when the same gauges will be applied on the head of miniature pigs, but also in one study on a living human. And we'll talk about this later. Here we have already an interesting indication about the Sutherland hypothesis, which states that bones move in order to allow the primary respiratory mechanism to happen. This is something that is not confirmed by all these studies on animals, so when nothing happens, nothing happens. I perfectly know this can be upsetting. I don't say that nothing happens inside the skull, but as we are going to see later more in depth, what happens inside of the skull is not sufficient to explain deformations or movements of skull bones, but we have agents that have been recognized to pull and to push on bones, and these are muscles, as we're going to see right now. If we go back to the research, they observed different strain patterns during the two functions that are suction and biting. For example, you will see here that the interparietal suture is mostly compressed, while the interfrontal suture is mostly tensed or stretched, while the frontoparietal suture is exposed to a more complex pattern of strain. They found that each suture is exposed to a dominant deformation regime, that some are mainly compressed, others are mainly stretched, and other sutures may undergo more complex patterns, alternating tension and compression, possibly combined with a shear component. They have observed that there's some sort of variability between functions. For example, bones don't move in the same way during suction or mastication, but there's also a degree of variability between individuals. So that's why they talk about predominant patterns that you see across more individuals, but at the same time, things don't work exactly the same way for everyone. For example, only for the fish with sutures completely patent, if one wants to give a precise movement that is valid for all individuals, it will be complicated, so they prefer talking about patterns. And we can see here that when we are in the presence of a species with available sutures that separate bones, if one wants to say precisely how all these bones move, they only can talk about predominant patterns, so we have to give up with the idea of a precise movement for one bone which would be valid for everyone, but we can still talk about general patterns of movement. And at the same time, we find back what we already found with the tibia, which tells us that from a certain standpoint, bones of the head and bones of the rest of the body have a lot in common. And for example, we find this great variability in the way people achieve the same function. The sensory motor strategies may vary from one individual to the other when they move an arm, when they walk, when they move the pelvis, but also when they move the jaw, and so they don't activate exactly the same muscles at the same time in order to perform a very same observable movement. Here you have pictures and drawings of the three sutures they are studied. Here the interparietal, here the frontoparietal, and here the interfrontal. This is an interdigitated one, this is an overlapping one, and this is an abutting one. If we want to identify trends between the form of the suture and the way it is moved, it is stretched or compressed, interdigitated sutures are often subject to compression. And we will go into the mechanisms that may explain this conformation later. But for now, we can already remember that interdigitated sutures are mostly compressed. Overlapping sutures are mostly exposed to a combination of strains composed of tension, compression, and probably also shear. So they may be alternatively tensed or compressed during a function, the same function, but bones that overlapping may also slide on one another. And finally, abutting sutures are mostly observed in regions that are mostly exposed to tension. This was just a glimpse of what the cranial course has to offer. If you want to go further and get full access to all current lessons, plus the new ones as soon as they're released, subtitled in your own language, just click the link below or go directly to community.cookielearning.com.